Season 1 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley, Daniel Murphy, and Douglas Dollars, who reminds you to be present, be loving, and that life moves really fast. Tell me the last fictional narrative you absorbed. What was that?
The last fictional narrative I absorbed? Oh, that's a hard question. I just did read and wrote a review of José Saramago's novel Cain, and I think I absorbed that pretty well. It might partly depend on what you mean by absorption, but one thing that Saramago does in Cain is he sets you going back to obscure biblical episodes that you think he made up, but then they turn out to be there. And so the absorption turns out to come from several sides at once and to meet in the middle of the cotton of my mind and react there. And I think that's what he wanted. So that was a good one.
And tell me one biological thing about that narrative.
Well, one obvious biological thing, it has very little to do with a theory of fiction, but one obvious biological thing is that Cain's birth is something that both the Bible and then Saramago has some difficulty in explaining why this production of evil at the same time as Abel, who is supposedly good, is also produced. Saramago has the angel who kicks Adam and Eve, or who prevents Adam and Eve from returning to the Garden of Eden. Saramago suggests, although never quite says, that he is actually Cain's father, and that Cain is born more or less in a kind of pre-annunciation, born more or less through the interaction of the angel who has a private discussion with Eve, and then Eve finds herself pregnant with Cain. That actually turns out to be not extremely different from a midrashic story about the birth of Cain. The midrash is the legends that grew up around the biblical text. They're always very interesting because they always attempt to explain away anything that's strange in the Old Testament. And the midrash on Cain is that Cain is actually the son of Samael, who's associated with Satan, and that's why he was born evil and became the first murderer. This is something that Saramago follows pretty closely in the midrash. I don't know if this is of interest to you, but in the midrash, Cain attempts to excuse himself to God for killing Abel by saying that, first of all, it was God's fault for not protecting Abel, and Saramago completely agrees with that argument. And then also says very interestingly, this is not in Saramago, but I was led to this by Saramago, says very interestingly that he had no idea that throwing stones at Abel would kill him because he'd never seen death. He didn't know how to kill. And so it was quite a surprise to him when Abel dies. So there's a kind of biological moment of what it would mean to be biologically aware of the biological fact of death. Rilke says in the Duino Elegies that what's so great about animals is that they are always intensely and absolutely in the present and have no idea of death and no thought of their own death. Cain in the Midrash, and to some extent Cain and Saramago, become those who discover death. It's not Adam and Eve who discover death, although that's how we're usually taught it. It's Cain who discovers it through murder.
And how is that for an introduction, listeners? It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting down in Westwood with William Flesch, professor at Brandeis University, author of Comeuppance, Costly Signaling, Altruistic Punishment, and Other Biological Components of Fiction. William, what brings you here to UCLA Town?
UCLA. I'm giving a talk at UCLA tomorrow on I'm actually doing a workshop called Literary Darwinism and its Discontents, and then I'm giving a talk about Paradise Lost and to some extent about Shakespeare in ways that they're not usually talked about, which have to do with narrative theory and the general narrative theory that I'm interested in and have been interested in for a very long time from both biological and philosophical and psychoanalytic perspectives is the nature of vicarious experience, why it is that we get so concerned about what's happening to others who are so unrelated to us, so indifferent to our daily lives and our daily needs, that they can be fictional, and yet we're still anxious about what will happen to them. So generally people who do narrative theory talk about 18th and 19th century novels as sort of the epitome of a certain kind of edge of your seat, but deep, emotional, and also eventful or plotful interest. But I'm interested in vicarious experience more generally, and therefore in narratives that will be very different from the kinds of narratives that narrative theory generally addresses. And so tomorrow that'll be Paradise Lost and to some extent Hamlet.
A core question here then, in other words, is you see someone reading a book, you ask, why do you care?
Yeah. And I ask, why do you care? Or maybe what I ask is, why do I care? Why is it that I can be so anxious and concerned and moved by what happens to non-existent people, especially in a context? I first got interested in this thinking about what it was like to be utterly engrossed and anxious about what happens in a movie. And the thing about a movie is the situation is so extraordinarily artificial that you are sitting in a dark theater with hundreds of other people. This was at Cornell, so the seats were not very comfortable, and you were aware of them. You're sitting in a dark theater with hundreds of other people in not very comfortable seats, noisy when people get up, noisy when doors slam, watching a screen, watching a black and white movie on a screen, watching, for example, Astaire and Rogers, who are interacting in extremely artificial ways on screen. And nevertheless, you're anxious about what's going to happen to them, even though you know what's going to happen to them. Astaire and Rogers always get together at the end. But something goes wrong. You hit a lost point. Oh no, you think. And I started wondering, why is it that in this, the very fact that we're watching the movie is an absolute ontological guarantee that what we're seeing is not real. If it were real, we couldn't see it. And nevertheless, we're very concerned about what will happen. So my interest in this question, which is a very long-standing, the biological part comes, or the component of the explanation, which is the biological part, comes much later. But my interest in the question is just, what is it that makes us so anxious about what will happen to unreal people? The standard answer, which is kind of grabbed from Freud, but is, first of all, Freud just kind of speaking off the cuff, and then people not even quite understanding what Freud said. But the standard answer uses the idea of identification, that somehow we see a character, we identify with that character, and by identifying with that character, we get concerned about what happens to that character. And I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that answer, except that it's pablum.
And nothing except it's pablum. So that there's everything wrong, it sounds like.
Well, no, it's not poison.
Okay.
Pablum will keep you going in the jungle if you absolutely need it. But it tends to be misunderstood, or identification tends to become a word that somehow suggests that we are having the same experience, or that I'm having the same experience as the person I identify with. So I might identify with Fred Astaire and think, oh no, Ginger Rogers, in rejecting him, is rejecting me. I might identify with Ginger Rogers and think, oh no, Fred Astaire, in being cold to me, although he never is, but in being cold to her is being cold to me. In Astaire and Rogers movies, it's always the case that there's some misunderstanding that Astaire is subject to because of the setup, and eventually when Ginger Rogers discovers that she's misunderstood the situation, it all ends happily. So if we therefore allegedly identify with Fred Astaire, who is, through no fault of his own, finds himself baffled. And the thing is, there's no question in my mind that I don't think it's happening to me. And I don't feel that it's happening to me. And if identification simply means something like empathy or sympathy, not quite the same thing, but either will do. If identification means something like empathy or sympathy, that's fine. But again, the question is, why do we feel such intense empathy and such anxiety about what happens to a fictional character? Why do we feel it in real time, even if we know that it's going to end happily, even if we know that things will work out in the end? What is it that causes us to feel this way when we know that what we're seeing isn't real? What we're seeing are images on a screen. What we're seeing is a room without a fourth wall, which we're nevertheless responding to as though it's a room with a fourth wall, in which things that happen in rooms with four walls are happening.
When I read reviews of books and films that the critic reviewing them thinks don't work, very often they'll say or allude to the fact that they don't care about the characters. Just, I don't care what's going to happen next. I don't care what's going on. What can we learn about the questions you've laid out from examining what's different between movies, novels, television series where we care and ones where we don't?
Well, so I think that's a great question, and I would say that the question of what it means to care about a character is going to be very importantly about what it means to care about what and whom that character cares about. One of the things that I think is really essential to a good narrative is that in one way or another we care about all the principal characters. If we take some standard taxonomy, something like what Dan Decker does in Anatomy of the Screenplay, where you have main, opposition, objective, and window as the four major types of character. That's a revision of standard theatrical taxonomies of hero, villain, confidant, objective, and fifth business. That there has to be a sense in which we care about all of them. There has to be a sense in which it's not only that we care about the main character, but the main character is surrounded by clueless and uninteresting people. Because if the main character is surrounded by clueless and uninteresting people, then if the main character cares about any of them, we'll stop caring about the main character. Often we talk about this as chemistry. That is what makes for chemistry between actors or between characters, is that we not only initially care about one character, but we agree that that character is right to care as she does in various ways about the other character. Is right to care that the person that she loves her back, but is also right to care that the villain realize that what he's doing is just wrong. Is right to care as much about the villain, as right to care as much about her friends as she is about her one true pairing person. And I think that the way narratives manage audiences caring about characters is going to be in a kind of complex and recursive and layered exposition of their interactions with others. I would say, just to put this in a maybe a very clear way, or a very simple way, but also I think a very, very important one, is to say that a successful work, and it's interesting that you bring up reviews as an example of this, a successful work is one where we will actually want to tell our friends to read or see or experience this. And we will therefore care about how our friends are caring about how the characters are caring about each other. And that one thing that I think is very important is to see that there's a continuity and across a spectrum of our relation to characters within a work and our relation to other audience members of that work. That's one reason that's one reason you need a laugh track on comedy.
Need or needed?
Well, I think you can do it with music. You can do it with a chorus saying "men" as you go from one scene to another. But I remember going to see. My father told me to go see the original Rex Harrison "Unfaithfully Yours," which he thought was the funniest movie he'd ever seen. Of course, he said that about 40 or 50 movies. But his tastes were and are infallible. I grew up going to see Chaplin movies with him, and he was rolling in the aisles, and so was everyone else because he was rolling in the aisles. And so Unfaithfully Yours, I was visiting New York where my parents live, and Unfaithfully Yours was on the day that I had to drive back to Ithaca. So I went to a 12 noon showing at the Metro Theater on, I think it was 100th Street, 103rd Street in Broadway, and it was completely empty. There were 2 senior citizens there and me. And it was the most boring thing imaginable. It was just awful to watch.
I take it those 2 seniors were not rolling in the aisles themselves.
They were not. It actually gave me an enormous amount of respect for the kind of judgment that filmmakers can make, that they know something will work without having a live audience laughing as they're watching the rushes, writing the script, directing the scene, and so on. But they still know that it'll work. It didn't work for me. It would have worked, I'm sure it would have worked in a completely full house. And a little laughter gets more laughter going, gets more laughter going. So a whole lot of the contagion of experience among a wide audience, that's vicarious experience too. We're enjoying other people's enjoyment of what they're seeing, or we're frightened by other people's fright. Another example of this is I saw Funny Games, the Michael Haneke movie, in a movie theater when it came out. And it wasn't full, but it was more than 2/3 full. It was maybe the scariest movie I'd ever seen. There's a scene where there's about 20 minutes, or there's a sequence in it where there's about 20 minutes of silence, and everyone in the audience is listening to hear whether something is going to happen or not. And every sound in the theater has everyone tense. You can't tell whether the sound is coming from the screen or from someone shuffling their foot in the theater. And the anxiety in that room was utterly palpable. There's another time, just this is a parenthesis, but the first time I saw the Roman Polanski movie with Catherine Deneuve. It'll come to me in a second. But at any rate, I went to see that.
Listeners are screaming it into their iPods right now.
Yes. Every time anyone moved in that movie, there was sheer fear. And then one person walked out of the theater, and as he got to the door, he just yelled at all of us, "Why are you doing this to yourselves? Why? Repulsion. That sense that you're in an audience and that you have a sense of how other people are responding means that your response is partly a response to their response. And that's the continuity that I mean, that there's the response of, let's say, a main character to the people she's surrounded by, or in a taxonomy that I use, which is somewhat different, the response of an innocent and to those who are either protecting or attempting to cheat her. Then her response to those people, their response to each other when they cotton on to what they're doing and either do or don't cotton on to her innocence, our response to them, our response to others who are either responding or not responding in the right way as we think it to how they're responding. All of these are a kind of social continuity where caring about characters has to do with a sense of a pro-social virtue in caring about characters. And that, as I say, that survives the actual experience of going to the movie, reading the book, when you tell people you have to read it. When you say to someone, you've got to read this book, and then as they're reading it, you say, where are you now? And, oh yeah, isn't that part great? And also, there's a kind of, we all have experienced this too, I think, a kind of resentment when someone doesn't like what we do like. That is, here's this amazing movie. I can't believe that you didn't like it. So to get back to Funny Games, my friends who saw Funny Games when it came out on DVD just thought it was ludicrous. They didn't find it scary at all. And I think it was the scary movie version of Unfaithfully Yours, which is that watching it alone, there wasn't that experience of other people's experience of what's going on. So my general claim is that vicarious experience is irreducible. It isn't a kind of first level degree of separation from direct experience, but that vicarious experience is something which is different from direct experience, and it's an interest and a caring about the direct experience of someone else, often when their direct experience is wrong and we know that it's wrong. Adam Smith gives an example of the fear that we feel when someone is asleep in a field and a bull is charging that person. And we feel fear, but the sleeping person doesn't feel fear. So we're, to use Philip Fisher's term, we're volunteering affect for the sleeping person that person doesn't have. So that would be a baseline and obvious example of vicarious experience, that we're feeling the experience that they don't, and it's an experience that is predicated on the fact that they don't feel it. The particular quality of our feeling is they're asleep and they don't know it. And there's no way that they could know that they were asleep and not knowing it. So our feeling for them is something that couldn't be their direct experience.
Now, your mention of Michael Haneke makes me think of just last night I was at a screening in West Hollywood of a new film by Michael Haneke's former casting director. The film itself is called Michael, no thematic relation to Michael Haneke, but it's about an Austrian pedophile who keeps a 10-year-old boy locked in a fortified basement. And I saw it with a group of people on a late-night show, and it was the feeling perhaps of us all reinforcing within each other the feeling of not knowing how to feel about what was going on screen, because I suspect this filmmaker, whose name is escaping me, wanted us to start to feel, if not sympathetic with this pedophile, then feel bad about all of the bad things that were happening to him, because that's what this filmmaker shows, is the pedophile undergoing all these trials and humiliations, ultimately death. And we were all sitting in this theater feeling like, geez, look what just happened to him. Oh wait, no, that's a pedophile. How does that fit into this framework?
Well, I think that's exactly right. One of the things that I'm interested in are stories about villains. And although what you're describing now isn't quite this standard set of moments in a narrative about villains, but when we think the villain's about to be caught, let's say halfway through a movie, we're thinking, no, that would short-circuit the plot. And so the fact that at least one component of our interest in what's happening to other people is a desire for their success, even if we have an ultimate desire for their failure, is part of the general thing that I'm interested in. I think in this case, and again, I think it's Wittgenstein has a great reiterated warning, which is be surprised rather than taking it as a matter of course that our natural response to things is whatever our natural response to things is. What's so great about Wittgenstein as a philosopher is that he makes us think about stuff that we didn't think about and wonder why it's like that. So the question that I think we should be surprised by, and not take it as a matter of course, is that everyone or every significant character in a story, we have one similar attitude towards all of them, which is that we want them to understand the story ultimately the way we're understanding it, the way we're feeling about it. For the villain, that ultimate understanding might consist in remorse for the innocent. It might consist in relief for the hero or the protector of the innocent. It might consist in something like some combination of gratitude and exaltation that things worked out. For bystanders, it might be praise that things worked out and jeering for the villain. But those are all ways that they come to the same gut level, visceral sense of understanding things the same way. So if that's putting things together, if that's the synthesis of how narratives work, the surprise is that we care about everyone. That a villain who's just killed randomly or accidentally and doesn't come to see that he's been defeated by the forces of justice, let's say, that's a disappointment. It's not only the defeat of the villain, it's the understanding of the villain that he deserved to be defeated and was defeated. That we really, really care about. And as I say, the surprise is that we should care so much about how the villain feels. So I think if that's the synthesis, then the analysis of that situation is that what's open in complex ways to storytellers is ways of making us very interested in and emotionally committed to, in a vicarious way, the experiences of such characters as villains. And feeling it matters. So again, to sum it up somewhat simplistically, but it matters to us that characters be as human as they can be, as anthropomorphic as they can be, if you needed to be that, but as human as can be. And therefore, part of our expectation and part of our commitment to storytelling is an expectation and a commitment to the humanizing of all significant characters in a story. And what I think, if you take a standard view of the history of art as a discovery of possibilities of abstraction, that is, that you start out with basic artistic forms, cave paintings of antelope or elephants, or fairy tales or Homeric stories or whatever, that especially once you have art as something that can be recorded, the possibility of taking bits and pieces. So if you take the idea that abstraction in 20th century art begins to some extent with focusing on the depiction of flags and umbrellas in late 19th and early 20th century paintings, and just getting very interested in what these little bits and pieces of a painting look like, and getting very interested in local techniques that are part of a larger and more obvious and more basic artistic mode or form. Then one of the things that's available to narrative, and has been available to narrative for a millennium at any rate, is fascination with bits and pieces of the things that it's really necessary that you get in order to go into narrative. If you take something like the Canterbury Tales, the idea that first you get a list of all the pilgrims, and some are good guys and some are bad guys, and some are standers by, and neither good nor bad, but then we get interested in each of them, and what Chaucer is so good at doing is getting us interested in each of them. You could say the same thing. I was actually thinking about this in Dante, that theologically the Divine Comedy is it's theologically appropriate in the Divine Comedy that the figures that Dante the Pilgrim meets in purgatory and the figures that he meets in paradise should tell him their stories. That is, their stories are stories about how they got to purgatory and how they got to paradise. And those are stories about the importance of their understanding why they are where they are. So those stories are stories which are autobiographical, where the autobiography ends with or begins with an event in their lives and afterlives, which is their understanding of why their autobiography or why their biography led them to where they are. And the culmination of their biography is that they understand why they are where they are. That's theological, and that's fine. Nothing in hell in Dante requires anyone to understand why they are where they are. And so the stories that are told to Dante in hell, they might be useful to people on earth, but as pure stories, it's as though Dante is there abstracting from stories of coming to understand the justice of one's own position, and he takes away that part of it, coming to understand the justice of what's happened to you, and only gets interested in the story and in the fact that they want to tell their stories to him, rather than some idea that the story has a moral. He gives it a moral, or he often gives it a moral, but he's also just interested in storytelling without a moral. And storytelling without a moral is for him a kind of abstraction from, and a fascinating abstraction from storytelling with a moral and storytelling which therefore comes to a just end. And so I think that the movie that you saw, I mean, obviously he's based on the real person who is keeping...
more than one in Austria, as I understand it. They have a problem there.
But you know, just imagine that it's a Dantesque story where we are interested in, although there's no reason for us to be interested in theologically or justly, in how Paolo and Francesca or how Ugolino got to where they are. We care about them. Dante gets rebuked for caring about them, but he does care about them. And that's because what Dante saw, what Chaucer saw, what many, many people have seen since, what Stephen King saw, is that being interested in the humanity of even the most inhuman characters and giving inhuman characters humanity is always fascinating. You know, think of that shocking moment in Schindler's List when the commandant realizes that he has it in his power to grant life. And there's a hopeful moment where we think that maybe we'll get a kind of Inglorious Bastards kind of ending where he just will finally do the right thing. And then he says no. He just randomly shoots someone again. And it's a completely shocking, unexpected Spielberg doing something unexpected for Spielberg moment. But what grabs us is our sense that there has to be some way to communicate even with the commandants of concentration camps, to think of them as human. There was a book a while ago called Explaining Hitler by Ron Rosenbaum that led to enormous debate, and the book itself was about this debate. And the debate was do you want to understand Hitler or not? And the idea is, the problem is, if you do understand Hitler, that humanizes him, and if it humanizes him, he's not the monster that he is. But if you simply treat him as a monster, then you're somehow caricaturing what a monster would be and not seeing the human potential for being monstrous. And I think that's always a tension in extreme circumstances, a tension between wanting the most evil people to feel remorse. Because if they don't, there's something really unsatisfying about that. And not wanting them to feel remorse, because then you can't sustain your sense of their evil. The example that I give in Comeuppance is the Great Onion headline that appeared 2 weeks after 9/11, which was "Hijackers surprised to find themselves in hell." And what I think is great about that is the word surprised, because if they were more than surprised, if they were shocked or distraught to find themselves in hell, that would be a way of acknowledging too much that they thought what they were doing was morally right, that they thought that they were engaging in an intense act of altruistic self-sacrifice. Just the word distraught would do that. If it were less than surprise, we would have no satisfaction. If it were simply hijackers in hell, if that were the headline, it would be, yeah, but don't you want them to see that they were wrong?
Satisfaction difference.
Yeah, and we always want them to see that they're wrong, and somehow the maximizing of satisfaction, what narratives have to do to maximize that kind of satisfaction when it comes to villains, is get them to see that they were wrong to just the right extent, but not beyond that, because then we couldn't think of them as villains anymore.
Now, since this is a conversation and it's going to be on the internet, I'd be remiss in not hanging on to the Hitler thing for a moment, because internet conversations love Hitler. Not that they love him, but they love him as a subject. Now, it makes me think of a movie came out about 10 years ago called Max, directed by Menno Meyjes, who was the writer of Indiana Jones 3 and thus got Spielberg of Schindler's List as a producer for this one. But it was a big furor when it came out about, here's a movie about young Hitler, a fictionalized episode in his life as a frustrated artist. And it's, how could you do this? How could you make a movie where Hitler is a human? The standard thing, which happens periodically when a creator makes a movie with Hitler that isn't Inglourious Bastards, I guess. And such a furor in 2002 when this movie came out. And I saw it, and I've seen it many times since. I go back to it for different artistic reasons because I find it satisfying in some sense. But the world also very quickly forgot about it because there was no... I don't know what it was lacking, but it didn't... There was no punishment of Hitler. There was no glorifying of him, certainly. But it seemed to maybe... Do works like this, can they lack certain elements of satisfaction that keep them from sticking around in the consciousness?
Well, I haven't seen it, but I imagine that they could. I think, the obvious, since we're talking about Hitler, the obvious thing maybe to compare it to is The Boys from Brazil. Mm-hmm. And there what you get are many Hitlers. And that's an elegant way to solve the problem. Because with many Hitlers, you can get the decent Hitlers who aren't subjected to the environment that turns them into monsters. And because they're decent, you can think of them as the kind of people who can feel remorse when they do the sorts of things that little boy Hitler did, or that we assume little boy Hitler did. They can, it's a Rosemary's Baby thing also. That is that Mia Farrow can say, no, but you're half my baby. And then there are also the very evil Hitlers who don't feel remorse, and because they are subjectively different individuals, we get to split, and I think this is something narratives do a lot, we get to split our sense of the evil characters who feel remorse, which is gratifying in one way, but frustrating in another, and the evil characters who don't feel remorse, who are... which is gratifying because we get to think of them as sheerly evil, but frustrating because they don't feel remorse. If you can get twinned characters, some of whom feel remorse and some of whom don't, that's a way of attempting to manage that difficult, and I think universally difficult narrative issue.
And I should clarify as well, this film Max ends at the point where young Hitler has just chosen politics over art. So in a sense, it's like, hey, wait, that's not actually Hitler. Like that's pre-Hitler Hitler. That's unsatisfying. I mean, that could be it as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that there's it sounds like the ending is an ironic one, and the risk of irony is that what you're essentially doing is putting the work on the viewer or the reader to work out the satisfaction for ourselves. If you put it in terms of satisfaction, that is, well, we know where this is going to lead, and what it's going to lead to is the end of the character that we took an interest in. But now we have to do the work. We have to do the work of realizing that what's going to happen. I love talking about movies I haven't seen, but realize that we have to do the work of hating the hateful things that are going to happen, because they're so obviously hateful that the movie maker doesn't have to do it. But if you take something like Inglourious Bastards, I forget his name now, but the villain in that, we hate him, then but we admire his cleverness. Then we're worried that he's going to cop to what's happened. Sorry, these are all spoilers. Then suddenly he's doing the right thing rather than the wrong thing, or more or less the right thing. And that's kind of good, but it's really hard to forget those first 20 minutes, that just tour de force opening scene. And then he gets punished in a way that we should have realized he was going to get punished, but we've forgotten. And I think Tarantino handles that perfectly, handles our sense of his charm, the humanity behind that charm, the fact that what's inhuman about him starts working the right way, that is his own greed, but that the inhumanity of his greed is actually a human way of being inhuman, and all of that is contrasted with Hitler himself in that movie, who we can't pay much attention to. He's simply the icon that he is. But there again, I think there's that splitting going on, both between him and Hitler, and then within our responses to him throughout the course of the movie.
Now, let's go back in time from Inglourious Bastards quite a bit to the 18th, 19th century novels you mentioned that become so important in this field of study. Tell me, what were those authors of those novels doing that makes them so biologically fascinating, a literary subject?
Well, I think what they were doing was they were really, really good at getting us to care about certain characters, and also misdirecting who and how we were caring about them. And the misdirection, of course, is an extraordinarily important part of any narrative beyond the most basic. And I think even thinking about it, even the most basic.
Now let's get some names out here. So for the listener who wants to know what novelists these might be, they should rush after. Who are the richest examples
of misdirection? Well, George Eliot. She does some really amazing misdirection in Daniel Deronda. People don't think of her as a novelist who misdirects, but she does. Anthony Trollope and Dickens. Those are the ones who would spring immediately to mind. Thackeray also. Their misdirections tend to be misdirections in our evaluation of character. That is, we think that we've copped to what characters are like, and then it turns out that we haven't, and that we have a certain kind of settled view of various characters, and then we're embarrassed to find... I mean, they're good at embarrassing us in our own judgments about their characters, and we're embarrassed to find that the characters are not what we thought they were like. Eliot herself has an amazing moment in Middlemarch where she's produced this just horrid, oppressive, clueless, dry as dust, pedantic husband figure in the character of Casaubon. And he's clearly just... It's just awful that Dorothea, the heroine, or the apparent heroine, has married him. And then Eliot, who's an essayistic novelist, begins a chapter where she is talking about what Casaubon is like, and then she says, "For my part, I'm very sorry for him." And she makes us feel bad for feeling the way she's made us feel up to this point. And she does it successfully. That is, and what's successful about it, in a sense, is that she's made us realize that we've treated him as a character in a novel, and that there's always something simplifying about doing that, that he's become the villain, and the kind of villain that we're not paying enough attention to as a human being. And what Eliot does is to say, know this thing that I've been talking about, not that Eliot's been talking about, but that I've been talking about, which is humanizing as much as you can in the reading of any narrative, that there's always a lot more humanizing you can do. All narratives are simplifications of humans. And so it's open to someone like Eliot, or bizarrely enough, someone like Dickens, to suddenly widen the field and force you to realize that you've been treating fictional characters as though they're fictional characters. And that's a really interesting technique, but Eliot in particular is good at it. Dickens is very different from Eliot, but he's good at it too. He's good at making us care about Scrooge when all we did at the start was to hate Scrooge. And how do we care about Scrooge? Well, we start caring about the way Scrooge cares about Marley and the way Scrooge cares about his own childhood. And then, strangely enough, the way Scrooge cares about his own uncareable about future self. And so he has a vicarious experience of himself, and that changes our vicarious experience of his experience.
Do we want to feel bad? Do we want to feel embarrassed about misjudging characters, about seeing them as shallower than they are? I mean, is that a feeling we desire in some sense?
Well, I think that is a feeling that we desire, and I think that this... let me just preface this by saying that people who object to the kind of arguments I make think that what I'm doing is taking cultural, local and cultural... or culturally local narrative experiences and universalizing them. And my answer to that, if it is one, is there's a weaker and a stronger answer. The weaker answer is that I'm really talking about the conditions of possibility of narrative. That is, I'm not saying all narrative has to work this way. I'm saying the fact that a huge quantity of narrative, a large number of narratives, in Western culture, if you like in English culture, if you like in Victorian culture, but in wherever you frame it, the fact that a huge number of narratives do work this way means that there has to be something psychologically or psychobiologically within us that enables them to work this way. The stronger claim that I would make is just that I can't give a good account of what a completely alien cultural experience from my own would be, and no one can give a good account of what an alien cultural experience from their own can be. And it's, I think, a universal of human nature that we think we know what the universals of human nature are, subject to correction. But I've had decades of correction, and there's certain things that I still think of as universals of human nature. And I would say that the reason I think that is that if people claim that they don't feel this way, they've never claimed that way in a way that's convincing to me, and I think it just then becomes a question of vocabulary rather than a question of genuine difference in how we respond. For the things that I still hold to. So, for the question of feeling bad, I think we do desire to feel bad, but I think that there are various reasons for it. One is that I think for both psychological and biological reasons, there's something very comforting in the authority of a storyteller who can surprise us and correct us. And what we can feel in situations like that is that the story itself is something that we can now trust. The fact that it has this power over us allows us a moment of trust. And to the extent that feeling bad is one of the modalities of trust, that is, I was wrong, now I have to trust you, I think it's extraordinarily important to the human species and to the fact that we're unprecedented cooperators with each other, which means to say unprecedented trusters of each other. No species trusts, horrible as humans are, no species has nearly as much trust among its members as humans do. trust of those who are not close kin, at any rate. Ants trust each other a great deal, but they share 75% of their genes. But no species trusts other conspecifics, as they're called, nearly as much as humans do when the conspecifics are not close kin. So it's really important for humans to be able to do what we do, that we do trust each other, and therefore there's a pleasure in trust, and the pleasure in trust is still there even if it takes the form of feeling bad. That is, feeling bad and now feeling corrected is feeling that not only can we trust, let's say, the storyteller or the authority or the parent figure or the teacher figure, or because all those things are on a continuum. Teachers tell stories, parents tell stories, authorities tell stories, authors tell stories. Not only do we trust them to know better than we do, but we trust them to care that we've realized that we were wrong about a character. When people say, I love Dickens, the love there is not so different from parental love. I mean, obviously it's very different, but it's not entirely different from loving someone into whose hands you're putting yourself, into whose hands you're entrusting yourself. I also think, and this is the other side of the same coin, that to the extent that we're thinking about the experience of other audience members, one of the things that we're doing is, and I brought up spoilers before, I think it's significant here. One of the things that we're doing is we're betting on an author. We're betting that on an author that we like, that author will get the story right, and that author will be effective in how other people respond to the story, how other audience members respond to the story. And whenever there's a sudden reversal, there's a sense in which we take our own sense of surprise or of not having seen this coming, which we take as a kind of deficit on our part, as also evidence for the fact that we were right to bet on this author, that we're quick enough to see how we got things wrong, and we get to bask in the reflected glory of seeing how we got things wrong. So if you think of, sort of complex twists and turns in a movie like Duplicity. Part of the pleasure in Duplicity, I think, is how quickly we see the meaning of a puzzling scene. And there's a kind of competition that we have with other audience members, which is I think to myself, oh wait, I get it. Do you get it? And I'm proud of myself for having gotten it, because that means that me and Gilroy, we're a kind of team there. He's done this thing, and I've understood it right away, and I'm also confident that other people will understand what I've already understood. So that's a kind of synchronic moment. That is, I'm watching Duplicity with other people, and we're all realizing what's going on, but I'm imagining that I'm realizing it a split second before someone else is. The long version of that is telling someone you have to go see Duplicity, and didn't you like the moment when? And, make sure you don't miss the moment that such and such happens. So there's a kind of alliance making when we bet on someone, and our bet is comes out right. We've made an alliance with the person that we've bet on. And that's also part of the whole dynamic of trust and cooperation and vicarious experience, which is what we're betting on is that other people will also come to bet on this person. That's really what we're betting on. I bet that you will bet on this person also. And if I win my bet, or if I feel that I have reason to win my bet, look how good that move was, or look how shocked I am by how badly I thought about Casaubon, then feeling bad becomes evidence that I've won my bet, because it's been effective. It's been done effectively, and it will be effective for you too. So there again, it's a question of our caring about how other people are going to care.
And what sense do you have of what popular fictional narratives today, whether they be books or films, or I understand we're in a golden age of television shows, what sort of narratives are doing a particularly adept job, do you think, of tapping into our evolved minds?
Well, I basically think that pretty much any page-turner or any fascinating show does tap well into our evolved minds. Again, I think that it's my claim generally is that you can learn a lot about evolution by looking at how narrative works rather than learning a lot about narrative by looking at how evolution works. But I do think it goes back and forth, that each helps illuminate aspects of the other. I think that well, I've been mentioning a lot of movies. If we're in a golden age of television, I would say that I'm trying to think what I would say about Buffy, but I think Buffy is a good example. That is that this question of humanizing characters. So what do you do with someone like Angel? So Angel, finally we get the wonderful vicarious experience of Buffy and Angel getting together, and the result of that is that Angel loses his soul again. And becomes awful. And what's awful about that is that he's not a human character. And what's shocking to Buffy is that what she's seeing there is someone dumping her in the standard, I finally had sex with you and now I'm going to dump you guy way that he has. But it's much worse than that. He goes, not only does he dump her, but he goes around and kills people. But it's important that he's so dehumanized there, because when he becomes rehumanized, the fact that he's killed people, it has to be important to us that that's not held against him. And so what we need to do is to be able to distinguish between the human angel with a soul and the non-human angel who doesn't have a soul. Or if you think of Spike, his opposite number in Buffy, there's, Spike, despite himself becoming human, which I think Whedon had to think really hard about what to do with Spike, because he's dashing and debonair, but that only gets you so far. And then he has to become deepened as a character. All of those are things that are kind of predictable if you just put it in this theory, in this idea of betting. That is, if you bet on a character, you want to have further bets to make on that character as the plot keeps extending. And if Spike simply becomes what he is at the start, if he's that throughout, then he becomes very flat. You have to think that you decide that a character is flat after you've seen enough of the character to see that nothing's changing, then there's nothing left to bet on. If there is something left to bet on, that means a character has to change. Good narratives are always about characters changing. A show like Buffy kind of doesn't go anywhere when characters are too flat for too long. And then starts going places when characters start doing unusual but still but things that still people might have bet on to begin with. So let's say you bet on liking Spike. Then it matters that at some point Spike has to save Buffy. If you like Spike just because he's a good villain, that's going to get old fast. So you make a bet. Yes, I like Spike. I want him to stay on the show. Yay, his contract was renewed. But it also means that he can't stay the way he is. Buffy can't stay the way she is. Those characters do have to change. I mean, I think this is true. I know you've talked about Family Guy before. I think it's even true about Family Guy. That is that sometimes characters have to do the right thing. And sometimes there's a great moment in The Merchant of Venice where Portia comes to confront Shylock and Antonio, the person whose life is at risk, agrees that yes, he's signed a contract to give up his pound of flesh, and Shylock and he and Shylock absolutely agree on what the contract gives Shylock the right to. And Portia says, yep, there's no way out of this. And then she says, and the great line is, then must the Jew be merciful. And Shylock's response, his shocking response is, on what compulsion must I? Tell me that. And what's happened is, for him, the word must is a legal word. That is, the law would compel him to be merciful, and he wants to know where in the law it says that he has to be merciful. It's clear that it doesn't. But what Portia means by then must the Jew be merciful is there's no other way out. So if you're betting on how to get out of this, you have to bet on Shylock's humanity. That's what we do bet on in narratives, is characters behaving in a human way at the point where it counts that they should behave in a human way. So Portia is thematizing that. Shylock's not about to be merciful, and it turns out that we're betting on Portia rather than betting on Portia betting on Shylock. But Portia thematizes that moment as, look, there's really no other way to get out of this. He's in a trap. He's in a bind. You've cornered him completely. The only way the story ends happily is you have to be merciful. So that's what I'm betting you're going to do. So what happens in shows like The Simpsons and Family Guy is that characters are true to form. And, you know, they're as selfish or as clueless or as self-dealing as they are in their extreme situational comedy reversion to type. But the heartwarming moment, and, you know, even Stewie at some point will do something heartwarming, if that's the only way out. And our bet that Stewie will do something heartwarming is partly a bet that the show will end reasonably happily. So it's a bet on a character, which is also a bet on an outcome, and a bet on an outcome which we are forced into making a bet on a character. And those are ways of deepening characters, that if we bet on an outcome, then the character who has to do something to make that outcome possible gets deepened thereby, and that ministers to our wanting, with whatever complexity we want it, but are wanting characters to be human, even wanting Stewie to be human. And our bet on a character is also going to be a bet on wanting the outcome that we want.
I've been speaking in West Los Angeles, the center, the fount of so many popular narratives from Family Guy to The Simpsons and beyond, with William Flesch, professor at Brandeis University, author of Comeuppance. And what else can they find of yours? So they can find lectures of yours, podcasts. You're on the internet in so many ways. Where should people go?
Well, so you should go to Amazon. I do have a bunch of lectures which are you can figure out that they're by me, although if you go right to the podcasting site, for whatever reason, I haven't put my name there. But if you go to iTunes or go to just Google the word, now I'm going to have to spell it. The word is Amimetobios, and it's Amimetobios. It's actually a cumbersome word out of Plutarch, and it's what Antony and Cleopatra called themselves in Plutarch's version of the life of Antony. It means no life like this one. So no, mimeto, like to, or mimetically, and then bios, life. So if you look for that either on the internet, Google that, or go to iTunes and look for that, you can find 3 or 4 years worth of courses that I've taught podcasts there.
Listeners, you have your mission, and William, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Well, thank you. It was a genuine pleasure, and I'm also really glad to meet you after having known you so long on LiveJournal.
Likewise, this has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. Keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to the people backing this season, including Aidan Nullman, Andy Cooney, Ben Bartley, Brian J. Dell, Doubt Us artwork, Greg Bigelow, Greg Linster, Henry Coronan, Humberto Grant, James Faber, Jonathan McCalmont, Mark Larson, Matt Warren, Mia Muratori, Nicholas Croft, Paul Doyle, Ray Maguire, Rob Montz, Robert Foley, Roberto Medri, Samuel Hansen, Sean Dudley, Small Demons, Stephen Ingles, Steve Himmer, TSD, and Wayne Wright.